Welcome to Administer Virtual Networking module. In this module, we will cover essential topics related to managing virtual networks in Microsoft Azure. You will learn how to configure virtual networks, network security groups, and Azure DNS. We will start by planning and creating virtual networks, including subnets and IP addressing. You will also learn how to create and associate public and private IP addresses. Additionally, we'll demonstrate the process of configuring virtual networks. Let's get started. One of the key parts in creating a virtual network in Microsoft Azure is to make sure you plan well. Now, planning is a key part because without planning, you can't create a virtual network. Now, creating is the easiest part of virtual networking. When we go into the portal, I'll demonstrate it just takes a few clicks away to create a virtual network. However, unless you've planned quite a few things ahead of time, it might cause you a little bit of issues. Things like the location, the region where you're planning to create your virtual network, it's very important. Once you've created the virtual network, the resources that live within that virtual network must be placed in the same region. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So it's very important to plan ahead of time. Also, you need to understand your IP address schemes that you're looking to create for your virtual networks. You need to understand what currently you have configured in your environment and map out other IP address ranges that you might need to configure for other resources. Number of addresses required in each subnet that you might need to work with. So all that planning is important ahead of you creating a virtual network. Now, when you're creating a virtual network, this could be for various reasons. You might be creating extension of your existing on-prem environment into the cloud, and you want to configure some of the resources. Again, you need to ensure if there are some IP addresses that you're using on-prem environments that you're going to connect to resources in the cloud, mapping of those IP address ranges might become even more important. Simply because in virtual networks, you can't overlap IP addressing schemes. Now, before we go into the details of creating one, let's discuss some of the details around IP addresses. Now, even though IP addressing in depth is not part of this course, however, as a prerequisite, you should have some understanding of IP addresses. Now, when we talk about IP addressing, typically you can think of IP version 4 addresses and IP version 6 addresses. Now, Azure caters for both of them. However, in this particular module, we're going to explore a little bit more about IP version 4 addresses. Typically, when we're looking at IP version 4 addresses, there are various address ranges that are not usable. We are going to look at a very few of them in this particular module just to understand on what we can do and when we create our network ranges. Now, to begin with, there is a standard that we must be aware of, a standard called RFC 1918. Now, RFC 1918, in other words, is a set of non-routable IP addresses that we can typically use in a network environment. Typically, you'll see these ranges. They start with 10 range, which could be 10.anything.anything.anything, obviously anything between 0 and 255, as an octet should be. Then the second range is typically looking at 172.16.anything.anything, and going all the way to 172.31.anything.anything, and the final range that you get to see is 192.168.anything.anything. Now, I'm very sure you must have seen some of these ranges used either at home or in your work environments, simply because these are most commonly used IP addresses in a network environment, internal to a network environment. Now, typically when you're creating your IP addresses in your virtual networks in the cloud, you will be referring to these IP address ranges simply because we refer to them as private IP addresses. Now, when you're creating your networking ranges in your virtual networks in the cloud, it will be from one of these ranges. However, if you require a resource that needs to connect directly to the internet, in that case, you might need an IP address, what we refer as a public IP address. Now, typically when you are looking at creating private IP addresses, these come at no cost. So when you're creating your network ranges, private IP addresses don't cost. And when you do assign a public IP address to a resource in your environment, this is a resource that comes as an added cost. Now, when we have a look at an IP address range, let's have a quick example of some of the networking settings that we have in my setup already. Let me just jump onto an existing network setup that I have. Let's assume we're looking at this example of Contoso, and currently Contoso is created with these settings. Let me break this down a little bit very briefly. As I mentioned, knowing the depth of IP addresses is good as prior knowledge for this course. However, for this particular module, you don't necessarily need to go in depth on all of those IP details just as yet. Now, looking at this IP address range, I have 10 range over here, which is 10.0.0.0/16, simply suggesting that the first two parts of this IP address is part of my network setup. So my network is 10.0. Now, within this network, you can see I have created some subnets, and the details are on the screen, things like HR, IT, and sales. So these are some of my subnets that I have within. Now, the subnets I've created, they belong to the same network, so they will always begin with 10.0. However, the next part that defines a unique subnet, since it's a /24, so 3 octets, 3 parts of this IP address will then define this subnet in this network environment, or this virtual network. Now, if I start looking at it, I can see I have an entire octet that belongs over here. That means this particular octet will range from 0 all the way to 255. That gives me altogether 256 addresses that I can utilize. Now, bear in mind, if you're looking at this number and thinking, well, from 0 to 255, you just said maximum 255. Where are you getting an extra number from? Well, bear in mind, we're counting from 0, not from 1. So that's altogether 256 addresses. Now, as part of that, something very important to understand. Again, as prior knowledge, we would expect people who understand a little bit into IP addressing to remember that there are 2 addresses in a network range that you cannot use. Typically, this is the very first address on the network range and the last net address on the network range. Simply because the very first address becomes the network identity and the last address becomes the broadcast address for that particular network range. So apart from that, that leaves me with 254 addresses in each subnet in this particular scenario as I'm looking at a /24 address. However, there are certain other details that we need to remember as part of your Azure setup. Now, if I carry on with this resource, let's assume I have a virtual machine called VM1 sitting right in my HR subnet. So if I was to create this very first virtual machine in this subnet environment, what will typically happen is it will attain an IP address from the subnet range that it has. Now, this resource, it needs to attain an IP from the range, but we need to understand, apart from the 2 addresses that we can't assign or the system can't assign, there are a few other addresses that we need to list down. Now, apart from the very first address, which in this case will be .0, which we just said will be the network identity, the other addresses that we need to be aware of will be .1, .2, .3, and the last address in this particular range is 255. Which we already said will be a broadcast address. Now, what are the other 3 addresses that I've listed? Typically, .1 in this particular scenario will become the gateway address or the gateway for the subnet, and the other 2 addresses are required by the DNS in the backend. Now, these are 5 different addresses that are reserved by Azure for every single subnet that you create in your network ranges. So it's important to understand that instead of taking away just 2 addresses, that is the default setup for any on-prem or any other network environment, in Azure Virtual Networks, we are looking at minusing 5 addresses from every range. So in this case, if I was creating a /24 subnet, which would give me around 256 addresses, however, we'll simply take away 5 addresses from this particular setup, which will leave me simply 251 addresses. Now, as a network administrator or an administrator managing virtual networks, this number becomes important, so you can plan exactly how many resources can you fit within a virtual network and a subnet, and then you can plan ahead of time. As we are already talking about planning of this virtual network, along with many other things, your IP address ranges will become one of the key parts in planning on how you will create your subnets and your virtual networks. Now let's have a quick look at this in the portal. Now I'm back into my portal, and looking at the portal, one of the first things I want to do is jump onto virtual networks. Either you pick that up from your favorite blades on the side that I have on my menu, or you can simply type in the search or look for new resources and you can find virtual networks from there. So let's start working with the new virtual network. Now, before we move any further, let's create a new virtual network in this particular setup and go through some of the basic details that we have as part of the setup. Now, already from the first few modules, we've covered that typically you're required to create 4 different details or provide 4 different details as your basic setup with any resource that you create in Azure environment. Now, if you haven't seen one of the module 2's video yet, please ensure you watch some of the details in module 2. Now, these 4 details, as mentioned before, would simply be looking at a particular subscription that you're creating this resource in, defining a resource group where this resource will be placed, and then giving it a unique name, and also choosing a region where you're placing this resource. Now for us, we'll simply go into the resource group that we are working with in this course, which is AZ-104 demo. Now, as for my virtual network, let's give this a name. Let's call this Demo VNet. All right, now my Demo VNet, let's change that to capital V. So Demo VNet, that's the virtual network we're creating for this part of the demo. Now, apart from that, we'll leave this in UK South and let's move on. Now, there are a few other tabs for us to create or complete to create a virtual network. One of the next tabs that we have is related to security. Now, we'll leave some of these options out for a later stage when we cover other topics to mention. We can choose to enable encryption at this stage. Now, this is where we can enable encryption between the traffic between my virtual network. And if I need to enable that, or if I have a requirement for encrypted traffic, I can enable this feature at this stage. However, it's important to understand a few other options, like it mentions that if I'm using a virtual machine within that virtual network, it must have an accelerated networking enabled. Along with that, also bearing in mind traffic to a public IP address is not typically encrypted, so bear some of those details in mind. Now, we'll cover Azure Bastion in one of the next modules when we talk about virtual machines, so we'll look at the details around that and I'll cover what this is and how we work with it. Along with that, we can choose to protect our virtual networks with adding a firewall. Firewall is not necessarily covered in this course, so we'll leave firewall details out for just now. We can also enable DDoS network protection, which is an added protection if we are looking to introduce enhanced DDoS protection for your networks. This comes at an extra cost, so we can choose to enable this at this stage. However, like I said, we'll leave some of the security features out just for now, and we'll come back to some of them a bit later in the course. Now, the most important part that we need to configure as part of the planning of my virtual network is to define my address range on this setup. Now, as I move along, I can see the setup suggests that I can choose an IP version 4 or version 6 address ranges. So like I mentioned, we can choose IP version 4 or version 6 in Azure. Now, if I carry on looking further down in my setup, currently the portal is suggesting that I start working with a range that starts with 10. However, like I mentioned, we can pick any ranges from RFC 1918 standard and define any one of those ranges. However, we can carry on with this particular setup. Now, it's giving me an example of 10.0.0.0 to begin with. I can choose this setup if I wanted to. It's suggesting something very, very important for me to look at this stage over here. Now, it does tell me that this prefix I'm using, the 10.0 range, because it's looking at a /16. So 10.0 range already exists. So it tells me there is an overlap in my setup. And I have existing in my current environment another setup called VM2 VNet or VM2 VNet for another resource that I've created, and that already uses this particular address range. Now, I can carry on working with this particular range for my new virtual network if I needed to. Azure doesn't stop me from doing this. However, it's part of my planning process now to understand, do I need these virtual networks in future to talk? At any point in future, if I have a need, let's assume the VNet that I already have existing, let's call this VM2 virtual network. So if I have VM2 over here and we are just about creating a virtual network just now, do I want these two to ever communicate or have any sort of connection between the two? If there was a need at any point in future, just because they have an overlapping IP address, this communication will never be possible. So it's very, very important to understand. A lot of the times we don't plan to connect multiple networks together. However, in future, there may be a need for whatever solution that you're working on to join these networks or allow traffic to flow between them. To avoid reconfiguring your virtual network IP addressing or having some of these complications of overlapping IP addresses, it's probably advised that we simply plan out or map out existing IP address ranges and try to see if we can come up with better addressing schemes if we can. Now, in this particular part of the session, we'll try looking at another example. Now, let's jump on to try and change this part of the network. So I'll keep my 10 range, but instead of 10.1, let's try 10.4. And I have another setup that's working on 4. Let's try 10.7, 10.8, and hopefully we'll get lucky at some point. So 10.9 for me is available on my setup currently, so I can use this range so we can start working with this particular virtual network as 10.9, the next available network range within the 10 area for me at the moment. Now, a few other things to bear in mind. Currently, it's suggesting that if I choose this network to be /16, the maximum number of addresses this particular range would give me are 65,536. Now, bear in mind, we'll have to start working with some subnets within this, and remember that you have to eliminate or bear in mind the reserved IP addresses that we need to exclude from the total numbers here as well, so we can manage that. However, for now, this is not something that we are going to go into more detail. As a part of the earlier conversation, I explained a little bit about IP addressing. As I said, we don't necessarily need to go diving deep into the IP addressing. There are tons of other tools available that can help you plan your network ranges. In the portal, you can simply come here and choose what is necessary or needed for your environment, and you can configure it accordingly. One of the important things when you're creating a virtual network is that you need to ensure that you create a subnet within a virtual network. Now, Azure requires you to have at least one subnet within a virtual network environment. We can't create a resource in a virtual network unless it has a subnet inside of it. So it cannot float just into a virtual network environment. It must be placed inside of a subnet. As a part of the setup, I can see that by default, the system is trying to create a subnet for me in this particular portal. Now, I can choose to get rid of this subnet if I needed to at this stage and create this virtual network without the presence of the subnet. However, in future, if I ever try to use this virtual network and place a virtual machine or any other resource within, it will ask me to create a subnet and place that resource inside of that subnet. So it's worthwhile we configure and plan our subnets ahead of time and create them as we create our virtual network. Now, we don't need to create all our subnets as soon as we start creating a virtual network. We can create them at a later stage as well. However, we'll create or configure at least one subnet as we create the virtual network, so it's ready to use and we can start placing resources in it. Now, for the configuration of my subnet, it's picking up the same address range for my virtual network, so it's starting off with 10.9 range, and as part of this particular subnet identity, it will be 0 to begin with, the very first subnet available in that network range. And I'm using /24 addresses. That gives me, like I said before, 256 addresses. But we should remember we need to minus 5 from this. As mentioned before, the first and the last address are typically reserved by default for addressing schemes in IP addresses. And the other addresses that we need to remember, that .1, .2, .3 are reserved by Azure for gateway and DNS. So we'll have to manage or plan them as we create this. Now, let's change some of the settings in here. So in this particular setup, let's go and give it a different name. Now, in my subnet, I can still create or make changes to it. Now, I can decide that I don't need /24, and I can change the subnet range in here if I needed to. Again, depending on your requirement that you're working with. And you can choose to limit the numbers of IP addresses in a subnet. For instance, if you're working with a resource that does not require that many IP addresses, your network administrators typically would like to conserve these IP addresses and use them wisely. So they might reduce the number of bits based on their need. Don't forget to subtract 5 from these numbers. Now, we'll leave the range as it is. Let's give it a name. This is our demo VNet. So let's call this subnet 1 as compared to a default subnet. So let's call this a subnet 1. And for now, I'll simply hit save onto that. We can see the new subnet name is now available for us to look at, and we can start working with this. Now, I can add another IP address range to my VNet. So the VNet can have multiple network ranges or IP address ranges. We can do this at a later stage as well, so it's not a must that I should do this at this point. So we'll have a look at some of these settings at a later stage. So bear with me till we complete this subnet, this virtual network, apologies. Now, let's move on from here. The next part that we're looking at, again, as we did before, we can create a tag or pick one of the tags that we created before. So we can create this under department. Let's drop this for my IT department, and let's plug that in. Again, we'll go and create another tag here. This time, let's create an owner tag. If I can obviously spell and talk at the same time. And at the same time, let's try to add an owner. This time, the owner will be IT admin as well. So let's plug this resource for IT admin to manage. And finally, we can hit create and review. Now, the process of the Azure environment is just going to go through, validate everything I've chosen. We can double check some of those details as my overview tab. Once you're happy with all the settings that are there, you can simply hit create, and it will take a few moments to create this virtual network for you. As we can see, the resource is now created. So let's go into the virtual network and have a look at some of the details. Now, the virtual network is ready. You can see I am in the network, virtual network, and you can look at the blade here. Currently, we are on the overview tab. And if we look at the details, we can find things like my current address scheme for this, and look at where this is placed, and the region I'm using along with the subscription details. Now, apart from that, let's go into a little bit more exploring currently what we can do in terms of managing my virtual network. Now, if I scroll further down and look at my address space, this is where I can find my current address spaces that I have. Now, the current address space that we decided was 10.9, and we created that network range. As mentioned before, we can add other network ranges as well to the same virtual network. So a single virtual network can have multiple address ranges. Now, in this particular case, I'm going to leave our virtual network with just one address range. However, one thing that's easy to see over here, that this is something that I can change. So it's not grayed out. That means I can change my current address range. Well, that's true. However, there's a constraint. If I start using this virtual network and start placing resources inside of this virtual network, once these resources start consuming IP addresses from one of the subnets within this virtual network, I am no longer able to amend the address range. Now, for me to amend some of that, I need to remove all those resources from the located subnet and then come back and change it. Or an easier way around would be simply going into a new virtual network and configuring a different network range. So you'll have to understand. Hence, sometimes planning can save you a lot of that effort. Now, let's leave the address range as it is. Again, there are some details available for you to look at. Some of the address ranges you can use, like I mentioned, RFC 1980 standard that you can look into. And a lot of these address ranges that we are working with are sided notation or classless interdomain routing addresses that we are working on. Now, apart from that, let's go through some more details. The next tab that I have on my virtual network is connected devices. Currently, I don't have a device. We've just created this virtual network. But if I did in future have devices plugged into this virtual network, we should be able to see all the devices that are part of this virtual network. And I can see what subnet they belong to, what current IP address they have taken. I can go further, looking into my subnets. I can see how many subnets I have, what IP ranges they have. And a nice thing to observe over here is the available IP addresses that I have remaining in this particular range. Like I mentioned before, we haven't created a resource in this. Typically this /24 range should give me 256 addresses. We can only currently see 251 because we have to remember the -5 of the reserved IP addresses. Hence, we can see available number of addresses now in this subnet is 251. So, hoping that makes it clearer in terms of understanding how the subnets look like. And if you're ever wondering how many resources can you place in an existing subnet, this will be a nice place to come and check currently how many IP addresses are taken and how many are available. So you can start planning on what resources can be placed under what subnet or existing subnets that you have. So let's stop here with the details around virtual networks and subnets for now. We'll come back to some of this as we progress within the course. Now, let's have a quick look at some other details. We've so far seen how we can assign address ranges and addresses to our subnets. What about allocating a public IP address to my resources? And we'll have a look at assigning a public IP address to a resource later when we create one. However, if there's a need for you to create a public IP address, let's have a quick look on how that looks like in the portal. Now on the top over here, we'll start looking at public IP addresses. And as soon as I start typing in public, I should see some of the resources suggesting if I'm looking for a public IP address. Now let's start looking at some more details around that. Now, I've got a few of them already created. Let's try create a new one. Now, as we request for a new public IP address, a few things to bear in mind. You typically cannot reserve a particular IP address range with Azure. You cannot give Azure an IP address and say, can I please reserve this? Typically, you will request Azure to create you a public IP address, and they will simply go and allocate one that's available at the time, and you can then utilize that for your resources. Now, if we start going through some of the details over here, so let's go through the basic resource settings that we require for creating a public IP address. Again, I'm going to choose a subscription. We'll drop this down into our resource script that we're working on. And this time you see there's no current name that's asking me to create for this public IP address as yet, but we'll have to define some of those details further down. Now, I'll leave this in UK South, and here we go. So asking me a name on what am I going to do with this public IP address. So let's call this for my demo, demo public IP. So let's call this PIP. So that's what I'm going to call my public IP request I'm generating right now. Now, as you can see, we can create a IPv6 address. We can request a public IPv4 address. We'll carry on with public IP version 4 IP address for now. Now, as I move further down, we can see we have a SKU. Currently, we only have a standard SKU available for IP addresses. In the past, we used to have basic SKUs. However, they are no longer available. They've been retired as of March this year. Now, currently, I am not placing my resource in an availability zone. We'll cover availability zone at a later stage in the course. So we'll discuss more about how we can make this a bit more highly available. As mentioned in Module 2, when understanding the structure or structural components of your Azure environment, we brought in availability zones in our conversation very briefly. Currently, I am going to look at allocating this resource in a regional setting. So I am going to configure this for a resource that lives in the same region. So I'll leave this regional for now. Again, I'll explain the difference between the two as we cover some more details in virtual networks within these modules. And let's go ahead with talking about some of the details. Currently, we can only use a static IP address. This is because the SKU that we're using, the stock keeping unit that we have for this is currently standard. So as part of the standard, we can only use a static IP address, and we'll simply use that to create this IP address. There is a routing preference option that we can choose. However, as it suggests within the information, you must choose this now. This cannot be changed at a later stage. You need to define if you would prefer Microsoft using their backbone networks to go as close as your end user before the traffic travels to them, or would you like this traffic to be traveling over the internet? Again, that comes down to your preference and your requirements for the solution that you're working with. For now, we'll leave it as Microsoft Network. Again, you can change that on your need. And I will leave some of the other details that are here for the DNS and your domain name label. For now, I'll leave them out. I'm not plugging in the DNS conversation as yet. We'll cover some more details on DNS in this module a bit later on. Now, all I'll do is simply jump onto creating this. We'll move away from choosing any DDoS protection for now, or we can add a tag like we have been doing. So let's go back in and add a tag for IT department and drop it into my owner as my IT administrator. Again, by all means, these tags don't have to be the same every single time. They can be completely different. We can add other tags to this. Like mentioned before, we can add cost center, we can add a resource need, we can add whatever reference you want to add to this resource. So but later on in your billing, you can find this resource out or filter this out as part of your bill management or cost management. Now, I'm happy with this. Let's go through reviewing some of the details that we've just picked from the menus. And all I need to do is hit create. And this is where I am now sending a request from Microsoft to create me a public IP address. As and when the IP address is ready, we should then be able to go into that detail and have a look at the public IP address that's allocated to me for this resource for now. And as you can see, it's created, and we can go back and see there's a public IP address available for me to use. Now, currently, this IP address is not associated to anything at the moment. As and when I'm ready with my resources, I can pick and choose this public IP address that I called demo PIP and assign this to a resource that I have in my environment. We'll see allocation of public IP addresses as and when we create resources further down in the course. This brings us to the end of this section of this module, Administer Virtual Networks. We'll look into covering some more details around virtual networking, including security and DNS, in the next parts.